This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A cattle market update from Livestock Marketing Information Center's Director Tyler Cozzens begins today's show. Tyler gives a market recap and talks about the Consumer Price Index and retail meat prices. Continuing the show is K-State Wheat Disease Specialist Erick DeWolf explaining a recent grant he received to research heat-tolerant strains of wheat stripe rust. Joe Gerken, K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist, wraps up the show by discussing how many species of frogs are in Kansas and how they interact with ponds. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with the cattle market update with Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. Tyler, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Tyler, starting our conversation off with giving us your cattle market recap.
Sure, yeah. So kind of looking at things, how they transpired this last week, specifically looking at the Dodge City, Kansas report here that we look at. Last week, looking specifically at feeder cattle prices on the steer side of things, looking at those weight categories in general is a little bit mixed, but those 5 to 6 weights were actually down slightly, $1 to almost $2 to $2.83, almost $2.84. 5 to 6 weights were actually $2.81. That's actually a jump from last week of over $20. But 7 to 8 weights were $2.50. Those were down about $4, almost $5. 8 to 9 weights were $2.55. That's actually an increase of just over $16 from last week. Then the 900 to 1,000 pound feeder steers were $2.31. That's actually down about $14 from the prior week. But I think if we look at some of these prices compared to a year ago, we're seeing a lot higher prices than we were a year ago, upwards of $14 to almost $20 across the board there for those feeder steer prices. Looking at the feeder heifer prices here last week, 5 to 6 weights were $2.95. That's actually a jump of over $50 from the prior week. 6 to 7 weights were $2.43. That's actually up $5, almost $6. 7 to 8 weights were $2.30. It's actually a jump of $4. 8 to 9 weights were $2.20. That's actually a decrease of about $5 from the prior week. But a little bit of a similar story, the 6 to 7 weight feeder heifer prices, those were actually up from a year ago. But compared to a year ago, those 7 to 8 and 8 to 9 weights were actually down $4 to almost $8. Now, kind of switching over to some of the fed cattle price recap here from last week, looking at the 5-area average price. Live steers and heifer prices, they were $190 to $191. That's actually down about $3 from a week ago. But compared to a year ago, they're up $5 to over $6 on a live basis there for steers and heifers. On a dress basis, steers and heifers last week's were $304 and $305. That's actually down $4, almost $5 there for steers and heifers. But compared to a year ago, prices are actually up $8 to $9, almost $10 there on a dress basis. Now, looking at some of those wholesale prices, specifically the choice box beef prices, the cutout value last week was $3.16. That's actually up about $1.60 from the prior week. A lot of that strength in the cutout value came from higher values for the rib and chuck, and also for the brisket and short plate. We did see a little bit lower levels there for the round and loin, and also for the flank. But in general, cutout value still holding pretty strong, and compared to a year ago, it's up $5, almost $6 there. So still seeing some good prices there as far as the wholesale value goes for beef.
Today, Tyler, also wanting to discuss a recent report that came out on Consumer Price Index.
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to discuss here was the Consumer Price Index, and that recently came out this last week, and that was for the month of July. I think this is kind of an interesting piece of information, kind of gives us an idea of what's kind of going on as far as general inflationary pressures within the economy overall. Last week, the CPI released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics for all items, the all items CPI, it actually measured inflation it was actually 2.9% higher than a year ago. So interestingly, though, this was actually the first time this inflation rate has actually been below 3% in more than 3 years. Last time it was below 3% was March 2021, and that was actually 2.6%. So this rate is still above that target 2% inflation rate that the Fed is looking to achieve. But I think this is still a positive direction for inflation to just kind of see a little bit larger reduction than we were expecting here for inflation rate. And so I think it's a generally a good sign for the economy. Now, looking a little bit deeper into the data shows that inflation on the food side of things has also cooled in recent months, which is a positive sign for consumers who continue to feel the squeeze of inflationary pressures. Now, in July, the food CPI was actually up 2.2% from last year, which is in line with what we've seen for year-over-year changes since the start of the year. They've actually averaged 2.2%, so very much in line with what we've seen over the last few months. Now, keep in mind, a year ago, the food CPI was actually 5% above where it was a year ago, so definitely a positive direction for overall food inflation, reported by the BLS there. Digging a little bit deeper here, BLS also reports a meat CPI, and in July, the meat CPI was actually up 3.1%. This is a little bit higher than what we saw as far as a year ago. A year ago was about 2%, so a little bit higher CPI there for the meat CPI. Now, a rise in the meat CPI is not totally unexpected, as it would include price effects from beef and pork, which have fluctuated over the last several months, especially beef. And to kind of point that out, the all-fresh retail beef price in July actually reached a record of $8.15 per pound. This is actually 4.6% above last year. And this also marks the first time that the all-fresh retail beef price has actually been above that $8 per pound mark. Now, retail pork prices have held just below $5 per pound for several months now. July was actually $4.92 per pound. That's actually up 4.6% from last year, and the highest price since we've seen for pork since October of 2023. So the combination of rising beef prices, steady pork prices are likely contributing to that 3 to 3.1% inflation rate for the meat CPI. Now, on the poultry CPI side of things, that was actually reported up just under 1%, actually 0.9% in July. The poultry CPI has been tracking around 1 to 2% above a year ago since the start of the year. So a fairly moderate increase there as far as poultry CPI goes there. And a lot of that is just due to retail poultry prices. They've been holding steady since the start of the year. Specifically, the retail broiler composite price has actually been ranging from about $2.40 to $202.50 per pound since the start of the year. July actually came in at $2.41 per pound. So a positive sign overall for price-sensitive consumers. Now, kind of gave some discussion there on just the CPI and retail prices. Let's dig a little bit deeper into these retail meat prices. You know, I had mentioned some of the retail prices in the prior discussion. So let's look at these prices. So in general, consumers continue to still face relatively high prices, especially for beef. You know, I had mentioned that in the earlier discussion that the meat CPI, that the all-fresh retail beef price was $8.15 per pound in July, which was a record. Now, overall, the last several months for the all-fresh retail beef price has remained in the upper $7 per pound range and finally reached above that $8 mark in July. Now, across the retail beef categories that are reported by USDA ERS for July, most are posting gains in prices around 2 to 8% above a year ago. Specifically, in July, ground beef was actually up 8% from last year to $5.50 per pound, and that's also a record. Since the start of the year, ground beef prices have actually been tracking above $5 per pound, a trend that will likely continue through the rest of the year. Prices for chucks and roasts both reached record levels in July. Chucks were up about 7% in July to $7.78 per pound, while roasts were up 8% to $7.12 per pound in July. Prices for rounds in July increased 5% from a year ago to $8.06 per pound. Now, sirloin steaks actually increased 2% to a record price of $11.73 per pound in July. Now, switching over to kind of some of the retail pork prices. On the pork side of things, the July retail pork price was actually $4.92 per pound, an increase of 4.6% from a year ago. Now, over the last 12 months, retail pork prices have been tracking between $4.70 and just over $5 per pound, with an average of $4.86 per pound. So that July price of $4.92 is very much in line with the trend that we've been seeing over the last 12 months. Now, looking a little bit closer at the reported retail pork prices, bacon is always one of interest, and it was $6.88 per pound in July. That's actually an increase of 10% from last year. Bacon prices have been in the upper $6 range since the start of the year. Retail prices for pork chops continue to hold steady in the mid $4 per pound range, a trend that has been in place for several months now. Ham prices have seen some strength recently, with prices in the mid to upper $4 per pound range. The strength in the ham price is largely being driven by gains from international demand for hams. Specifically, the U.S. exports a large number of hams to Mexico, so that's providing some strength there for those ham prices. Now, switching over to the chicken side of things, as I had mentioned earlier, according to USDA-ARS data for the retail composite chicken price in July, it was $2.41 per pound. Now, I'll just note that since the start of the year, chicken prices have ranged from about $2.40 to $2.50 per pound, so that July price is well within that range that we've been seeing over the last year. Now, the fairly steady chicken prices are a positive for consumers, especially those who are a little bit more price conscious and looking to extend each dollar at the grocery store. Now, looking a little bit closer at retail, chicken prices, chicken legs and chicken breasts specifically, those prices have been showing a little bit of weakness here in recent months, falling about 5 to 12% in both those categories there. Now, chicken wing prices have softened a little bit here in recent months, but they did reach a high of $2.64 per pound about 1 to 2 months ago. Prices now are actually tracking around $2.50 per pound. But I think if you compare that to a year ago, that's still very high prices for chicken wings, because a year ago, chicken wing prices were actually $1.30 per pound. So still a big increase in those chicken wing prices. Whole prices at the retail side of things were actually $1.99 per pound in July. That's actually down slightly from the record price of $2.01 that was actually only set just 2 months ago in May. So overall, there's been some relief in retail meat prices, but inflationary pressures are still evident in some retail meat prices, specifically beef, for example, is one of those where we're still seeing some record prices there. But I think this is important to note because this is still seeing some this is still a limiting factor for consumers who are, looking to save a little bit of money there and extend each dollar when they go to the grocery store.
Tyler, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our cattle market update.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
That was Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back.
Tuned back into Agriculture Today. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we continue today's show by talking with Kansas State University wheat disease specialist Erick DeWolf about research involving heat-tolerant strains of wheat stripe rust at K-State. Erick, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Kicking off our conversation by mentioning a grant researchers at K-State have recently received.
That's right. We did just recently receive a new grant from the USDA to study wheat stripe rust and some of the heat-tolerant strains that we feel are emerging in this part of the world.
You've talked about stripe rust on the show before, but just another reminder, what is it?
Right. So that's a great place to start. So wheat stripe rust is a fungal disease of wheat, and it takes its name from the bright yellow or orange streaks or stripes that it forms on the leaves as it begins to invade and cause the disease or damage to those leaves of the wheat. So the fungus will actually penetrate inside the leaves and then establish a very delicate feeding relationship with the plant itself. So it's actually not outright destroying the cells, but it actually just initially establishes a very delicate feeding process. It's almost parasitizing the cells of the plant.
What physical indications can producers use to identify stripe rust in their wheat?
Well, there we're going to go back to some of the visible signs. Usually lots of times we'll see this bright yellow or orange spores of the fungus, or the seeds, the equivalent of fungal seeds here. The spores are able to allow the progeny of the individual fungus. So the key diagnostic feature for wheat stripe rust, again, is these bright yellow or orange spores of the fungus, usually orientated in stripes or elongated lesions on the surface of the plants.
When does stripe rust start to appear, and then when should producers be scouting for it?
We usually will see the first occurrences of stripe rust here in Kansas in usually mid-April. And usually when we first start to get those first reports, whether we find it ourselves or crop consultants or growers let us know what they're finding, we'll try and get the word out and let people know where in the state it's being detected. And then from there, we try and do weekly updates to help inform people of kind of what's the latest status on the distribution of stripe rust in the state. And that usually continues through from mid-April, all the way through early June.
How should producers go about treating stripe rust?
Stripe rust is a disease that we can manage in two different ways. The primary means that we'd like to see people use to try and manage this disease is genetic resistance. The varieties that we grow, the varieties that individual growers select, have varying degrees of their genetic susceptibility or genetic resistance to this particular fungus. Remember, this fungus, has that very delicate feeding interaction with the plant, and that means that we can often alter that feeding relationship through genetic resistance. But genetic resistance is the primary tool that we'd like to see growers use, so variety selection is very important. The second mechanism would be foliar fungicides. So if the genetic resistance isn't holding, the pathogen sometimes will mutate and be able to bypass sources of genetic resistance. Or if they know they have a susceptible variety, they can be watching for signs or symptoms of the disease in their crops or activity in their area. And then they can decide based on the value of the wheat, the cost of fungicides, whether it's worth trying to come in and rescue the crop and prevent any future damage with foliar fungicides.
Erick, what was the situation or problem that led you to want to do this research?
Well, that's a great question. I think that actually goes back, if we almost have to set the stage here by going back to around the year 1999-2000. And prior to the year 2000, wheat stripe rust was really a non-issue for us here in Kansas and the Central Great Plains. And during the subsequent last 20 years or so, we've had major problems with this disease, overcoming sources of genetic resistance and frequent epidemics, often resulting in hundreds of millions of dollars worth of potential losses to the wheat growers here in Kansas, and also similar losses in adjacent states such as Oklahoma, Colorado, and Nebraska. So that's a major disease. It's now, based on our yield loss estimates that we do with the Kansas Department of Agriculture, stripe rust has emerged as one of the more damaging diseases to our yield loss in this part of the country.
What are some of the main objectives of this research?
Well, so historically, again, kind of building on some of the thoughts that we just had going there, one of the things that allowed stripe rust to emerge in this part of the world and this part of the country as a major problem is that the fungus was able to overcome some of the genetic resistance that we have been depending on for many years. About that same time, these new strains of the fungus that were introduced from other parts of the world not only were able to overcome those sources of genetic resistance, but they also appeared to be better able to tolerate the warm temperatures or heat that we often experience during our wheat-producing regions, during our wheat-producing season. So it was a combination of those two things that allowed the disease to thrive here. Ability to overcome the genetic resistance and this adaptation or potential adaptations to heat stress. Still, even with that adaptations to heat stress, many growers would report to us, or we had observed ourselves, that the disease was still favored by cool, wet environments, weather conditions. So now we have a disease that's somewhat adapted to our environment. We know it has the potential to cause a lot of damage. But what we began to notice is that the fungus wasn't being slowed by warm temperatures as much as what we had seen previously. And many growers were counting on that information or looking for, based on their past experience with it, that, we've had 3-4 days of 90-plus degree maximum temperatures. The disease should be slowing, right? Well, it turns out it wasn't slowing down, and we were seeing the fungus continue to remain active even after experiencing heat events that we thought historically should have slowed the fungus down and stopped the development of the outbreak. So it was based on this idea or these observations that we started to gather and collect some individual members of the current population, compare it to some historical populations of the fungus that we had from even prior to our race change or the types of the strains that were introduced. So back into the 1990s and then 2000, 2010, when we started to experience striped rust in this region. So now we have this whole timeline of individuals representing different points in time of the pathogen population that we can then test to be evaluating if this has been a steady progression of the further adaptation of the fungus, or whether this is actually an additional incursion from other parts in the world, yet again, much like we experienced in 2000 when the disease first emerged as a problem. So part of what this grant is trying to do is characterize the ability of the fungus to tolerate heat, begin to answer some of those questions. Is this an adaptation of the fungus, or is this an outside incursion from other parts of the world that are allowing striped rust to cause even more damage than what we've experienced in the past?
Erick, why is this research important for producers?
Well, I think the importance is tied to the potential for the disease to cause yield loss here in the state. Like we talked about just a few minutes ago, the disease has, in the last 20 years, has quickly moved to be our number one disease threat to our wheat production here in the state. And it's causing hundreds of millions of dollars every time we have a major outbreak of striped rust in the state. So there's a lot of resources, a lot of livelihoods, a lot of farm income that's at stake every year this disease goes uncontrolled. Ultimately, what we're hoping that we'll be able to do is develop predictive models to be able to help growers evaluate whether the temperatures that they're experiencing really are going to suppress the development of the disease, so that we can better advise them to make fungicide decisions and determine whether they really need to use a fungicide or not to suppress the development of disease.
Erick, how will farmers be able to potentially apply this research's findings to wheat production?
Well, yeah. So hopefully there's some direct applications of the research findings. So a lot of the things will be about the fungal population. They'll be about characterizing its ability to tolerate heat. But the application of it, again, is likely to come through recommendations that are flowing out through extension, either through Agronomy's e-updates, radio interviews like we're doing now. But it's all about trying to get the word out about when and where striped rust is potentially emerging as a threat to growers here in the state.
Erick, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Happy to help.
That was Erick DeWolf, K-State wheat disease specialist, on research that started July 1st about predicting yield losses caused by heat-tolerant strains of wheat striped rust. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we're taking a short break now, but stay tuned in because we'll be back with more up ahead.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show talking about frogs with K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
How many frogs and species of frogs are there in Kansas?
Yeah, there's a lot of different species of frogs. So there's about 22 known species of frogs. That number varies a little bit depending on how you ask. So some people like to say there's a few more than that. There's some fights about whether a species is really a subspecies or not. Really sciencey, nerdy type stuff that people like to argue about. But for the most part, let's stick with that 22 number, which even that surprises a lot of people that there's that many different types of frogs.
So what are a few of the different types or characteristics of frogs?
Yeah, the most common frog that we're going to see is probably the common bullfrog. And so that's a really big frog that people see. It kind of sounds like a cow mooing for our agriculture group. That'll be a good analysis for them. But kind of the bigger frogs, they can weigh up to a pound. That's a really common frog that we'll see. There's a lot of different species that can be found around your pond or around waterways. Some of them are really small. Cricket frogs, for example, are about the size of a cricket. And some species actually live in trees. And so in the eastern half of the state, primarily, you can see two different species of tree frogs. So there's the gray tree frog and there's Cope's tree frog. And those two species kind of live in trees. So some cool adaptations there to help them do that. They have these like sticky pads on their fingers, which are kind of like advanced fingerprints, but it helps them to be able to grab on to lots of different things. And sometimes people see them on their windows or, fun places around their house. So that might be kind of a cool place to see them. One of the really neat things about those tree frogs is that they can change their colors. They're the only two amphibians in Kansas that can do that. They're not going to have bright royal purple and support K-State on game day or anything like that, but they can change their color to blend into the habitat, which is kind of a cool feature.
Are the tree frogs and frogs hanging out by ponds eating the same thing, or what are they eating?
Yeah, so they're both found in the similar areas, and mostly they're going to eat bugs. And so they kind of have a process where they change throughout their life. So they start out as an egg with an egg yolk that provides nourishment to the tadpole. Once they get rid of that egg yolk, they can have the tadpole itself generally eats a lot of algae. And then, after that, depending on conditions, they'll transition into a frog. So pretty cool little thing. And their food can change along the way. So they go from having that egg yolk that they're absorbing to the tadpole eating mostly algae. And then older tadpoles and frogs primarily eat insects and other types of bugs.
Talking about eggs, tadpoles, and then them becoming a frog, how long does that take?
Tadpoles can kind of control how long it takes. So most of the time it takes 2 to 3 months. If you put a bunch of predators around these tadpoles, they're going to speed that up. They're going to make that change, within a month or 2 months. So they can make it faster. If the tadpoles are hanging out, there's plenty of food and nothing's scaring them, they can sit there for, like bullfrog tadpoles can sit there for a year or two and just kind of hang out. They're happy, they're healthy, they're not going to change. So that amount of time can really change. It can be sped up or slowed down, but on average about 3 months.
Is there any concern for the number of frogs that are in Kansas?
Yeah, so the numbers are fairly stable for most frogs. Some areas have seen declines, and that's mainly related to the amount of water we have and the water quality. But for the most part, most of the species of frogs that we have are pretty happy and pretty healthy.
Are there any concerns for frogs when it comes to other species, Joe?
Yeah, that's, I get asked that a lot. So there's a bunch of frogs around my pond. Is that a concern? And generally that's a really good sign. So if frogs are at your pond, that means that water is probably pretty healthy. Frogs can absorb a lot of the water, and that means a lot of potentially contaminants through their skin as well. So things can move in and out of an amphibian's skin pretty easily. One other thing that it can indicate, if you have a ton of tadpoles in your pond, there probably aren't a lot of bass in your pond. Because if there were a lot of bass, they'd probably be eating those tadpoles. So that's not always 100% correct, but that's a pretty good indication that, hey, maybe you have a lot of predators or you don't have a ton of predators.
Really any concern about caring for the frogs, or just go out and enjoy their lovely sounds they make in the evenings?
Yeah, listening to their frogs is really cool. A lot of people listen to birds, and they really enjoy the calling of birds. But if you have a pond, listening to the frogs, and if you really sit there and listen and try to differentiate all the different species, you can really start to hear lots of different calls. And it's really cool to kind of be able to start picking out the different types of frogs and their calls that you might have.
That was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.